I've created over 40 procedural effects for Blenders Compositor, ranging from simple and intuitive color correction tools to more complex setups to produce lens flares, glitches, VHS effects, and camera shake. All of this has been made possible by Blender's new 4.5 update. Regarding the update, I saw most people get hyped about the Vulkan support and the new geometry nodes, which I felt like overshadowed the pretty huge update of the compositor. Almost every value of the compositor nodes now has an input socket, which allows for a lot more complex and interconnected node setups, especially because it means you can hook those values to the inputs of a node group. We also got a few new nodes, like the image info node, to get information about an image's resolution and transformation. And you can also use the procedural texture nodes you know from Blender's geometry and shader nodes. So the compositor gets even more potential for creating procedural setups. Before, you could only add textures from Blender's texture panel, which would leave the input values inaccessible from within the compositor. We have a lot of interesting effects here. Let's go over some of the more basic ones first. Despite their simplicity, they fulfill rather essential purposes, which is why you might already know these effects from other software, like vibrance to boost the saturation of low saturated pixels, which is quite useful to combat the grey washed out look you get from linear color spaces, or add a vignette, edge softness or tilt shift blur. I've also created a white balance node with more artist-friendly controls than Blender's default one. In fact, I created a whole Uber color correction node with toggleable adjustments that I modded after the features from WAR photo editing softwares. Then we also have some effects that are kinda in between, like a drop shadow, edge detection, outline generation, paint effects, and both turbulent and wave displacement. I've also added a twirl displacement, which was quite a headache to create and get the inputs to make sense, but yeah, it's there and it works. If you're into the creation of motion graphics, there are also some effects which have been designed to be easily animatable or have a customizable speed value to control its evolution over time. For example, you can play around with the quite flexible glitch effect or add impacts and transitions using the shake and RGB slide effect. The RGB slide effect is inspired by the slide effect from Video Copilot's Twitch plugin. The shake effect used to generate vectors for Blender's vector motion blur, but in the new update I've assigned it to use Blender's directional blur instead, since it gives a more dramatic blur on rotations. It basically uses two directional blur nodes that use different frame offsets to create motion blur while taking the motion of multiple frames into consideration. It also has an option to toggle mirrored edges. Those are quite performance heavy, so I would recommend only enabling them when going for the final render. There are also various generative effects. I'm especially proud of the new lens flare, not only because it looks good, but also because it is very customizable and a lot less heavy on performance than previous compositing lens flares in Blender. Instead of using a lot of iterations of Blender's glare node, it relies more on multiple masks and textures. I think it turned out to look really nice, especially since there are a lot of details, like the lens flare getting brighter when getting closer to the center, and the flares have fall off and a visible rim from the lens. You can also customize lens overlays like dirt and small hairs that become visible when hit by the lens flare. There's also a dedicated overlay node, which you can use to generate an overlay with fall off towards the edges of your image. You can also create blinds and scan lines using the Venetian blind effect. It already integrates an exposure and glow, which gives the effect a lot more character. Then there's also the flow texture node, which is very flexible and is ideal for creating procedural backgrounds. Probably the most impressive effects of this pack are the ones from the complex filters category, which emulate the characteristics of different media. For example, a CRT effect, which emulates the characteristics of certain old TVs. Then I've also made an NTSC effect, which I've modded after this open source NTSC project. By the way, they have a free OpenFX plugin, so you can use it in programs like Netrun or DaVinci Resolve. I previously already had a VHS effect in the pack, but because of the before mentioned limitations regarding textures, I've created a completely new VHS effect. And I think it turned out really good. Very customizable, signal modulation, noise, tape damage, chroma shift, chroma loss, and displacement effects for tape wrinkles. You can also use the border bars effect on top of it to play around with different aspect ratios. The pack uses Blender's asset library because I found it quite helpful to use the thumbnail feature of it, so we can quickly see what to expect from an effect and don't have to trial and error every effect first. This is especially useful for the additional preset color corrections of the pack. The asset library also makes it possible to just add the effects by using Shift-A in the compositor. The effects have been categorized into different purposes and functions, and the nodes are color-coded accordingly. For resource-heavy nodes, you can also use the disable toggle to deactivate the effect and save performance. Usually, muting the node will save more performance, but using the toggle, you can keyframe the visibility of the effect, which is useful for both the final result and while look developing. I've made sure to use good default values for the nodes and to limit them to the ranges the values felt best at. Of course, you can still type in a custom value to overshoot the limits. I've tried to add a description to most of the inputs, which become visible when hovering over each value, so you will get some information about what the values are affecting. You can also always go into the node groups and examine how they work and adjust settings that aren't exposed as inputs. I've tried to organize and label the setups inside the node groups so you can get a better understanding of how everything works. You can also check out the official documentation of the pack. I still have to add entries for all of the new effects, but it already gives you instructions on how to install the pack and shows you some examples of the effects as inspiration. To enable the real-time compositing of Blender, you have to expand the drop-down next to the viewport shadings and select whether the compositing should be always applied or only when within the camera. For performance reasons, I prefer limiting them to the camera view. The real-time compositing is always using your GPU when possible. If you also want your GPU to be used for the compositing of the final render, you can open up the Properties panel and change the rendering device under Options. In my experience, the GPU compositing has been a lot faster. Even multiple of my node groups were able to process in under a second. The only setbacks you might experience are when dealing with very complex 3D scenes. In this case, you should look into the Simplify option of Blender. In my experience, Blender's Compositor was a lot better at handling image sequences than video files, because only image sequences appear to be cached for the compositor. Of course, you can also use the pack and the compositor for image editing, especially if you like layering multiple effects on top of each other. It can also increase the performance when zooming out to make the preview smaller, because it will have to render a lower resolution. You should always make sure that the entire camera view is on the screen. If you zoom in too much, the compositing might be rendered inaccurately. I sometimes got asked whether the effects will be baked into the render, and the answer to this is they only will if you set it up accordingly. If you have a 3D scene with a finished compositing setup, you might want to make changes to some of the effects without having to re-render the whole 3D part. In this case, you could simply deactivate the compositing, render your 3D scene, and then import it as an image sequence into the compositor. Or you could use Blender's file output node and connect it to your render layers. This way you can specify two file outputs within one render queue. So you can set it up to output both the raw and the composited version. When rendering your scene as an OpenEXR multi-layer, you should also automatically have the compositing on a separate render path. Blender's Compositor doesn't give you the ability to add text elements to your scene, but you can add and animate text within the 3D viewport and use it as an input for your compositing scene. Of course, this isn't limited to text. You can make use of all the different objects and tools Blender has to offer. But using the compositing pack, you now get the ability to add visual effects to your scene and edit them in real time. This makes Blender a really powerful After Effects competitor, since it has the ability to create 2D, 2.5D and 3D footage. And using geometry nodes and grease pencil, you can also add procedural and hand-drawn animations. I didn't want to gatekeep this pack to be only used by people who have the privilege of affording it. So the pack is available using a pay what you want model on Ko-fi and Gumroad. This means you can also get the pack for free. However, it still required a lot of time and effort to put this pack together, so I would appreciate if some of you would spare a few dollars, as long as you're able to do so. If you want to test the pack first, you can also just claim it for free and then tip me on Ko-fi if you found joy in the pack. I've also put the pack on Superhive, which was formerly called Blender Market, where it has a fixed price tag because I couldn't use a pay what you want pricing there. If you buy it there, 10% of the money I receive from Superhive will be donated to the Blender Foundation, so you also support the development of Blender itself when buying it on Superhive. If you find any bugs, have feedback, or would like to tell me about features you want to see in the future, you can use the form on the landing page of my documentation. Yeah, that's all. If you're also interested in different open source software, you should subscribe to my channel or watch one of my already existing videos. See ya!